He keeps going, despite the failures, knowing, hoping, ultimately, that he's helping people. He's been doing this for a long time, but still, when I think of Spider-Man, I think no matter what, he's never going to stop trying. Today on the Comic Book Report, Spider-Man by Chip Zdarsky Omnibus. Stick around and check it out. Greetings webheads, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I'm back in the world of Spider-Man doing another omnibus review for a book I've wanted to check out for some time, including not only his run on Spectacular Spider-Man, but the incredible Spider-Man life story and Spider's Shadow. This Zdarsky omnibus for Spider-Man is just packed out. And while I can't wait to dive in, I do want to shout out and say thank you to the channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. If you're looking to pick up your own comic book collected editions, I highly encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link for it in my video's description, and if you see anything there you like, you can use my discount code at checkout, TheComicBookReport, to save $2 off of your order. Please note if you do make a purchase using my code or affiliate link, I will earn a small commission, but it's a fantastic way to support the channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's get started with today's review. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Chip Zdarsky and illustrated primarily by Adam Kubert, Mark Bagley, Pasquale Ferry, and more. The comics in this volume were first published by Marvel Comics beginning in 2017. The volume collects Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, issues 1 through 6, as well as issues 297 through 310. Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man Annual Number 1, Spider-Man Life Story, issues 1 through 6, Spider-Man Life Story Annual, issue 1, Spider-Man Spider's Shadow, issues 1 through 5, and material from Free Comic Book Day 2017, Secret Empire. Now this is an oversized hardcover edition with nice glossy print paper stock, a sewn binding, and a total of 936 pages. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at that Chip Zdarsky Spider-Man Omnibus. Right from the jump, I'll say this is the standard edition cover. They released 2 direct market or DM covers for this omnibus as well. I'll go ahead and throw up some quick thumbnails so you can compare. But I honestly think all of the different covers look fantastic. I am partial to the standard edition where we have the kind of Superman homage. We have Peter Parker kind of opening his shirt up and you see the Spider-Man logo underneath. As far as the spine goes, I really like it. It is a very soft, almost baby blue with some white text. My edition, the standard edition, has a little picture of symbiote Spider-Man on the bottom. I believe the picture is different for the different covers, though I can't confirm. But yeah, I think it's a really nice looking spine. I don't really have any other omnibuses that are that color, so it really does punch out on the bookcase. As we make our way to the back cover, it also has that same color from the spine, mixed with some red and white Spider-Man imagery. We have some blurbs about the book, content, pricing information, things like that. I would say it's a pretty straightforward dust jacket cover, especially the back is kind of what you would maybe expect for a collection like this as far as the details involved. Overall, though, pretty solid dust jacket here. And speaking of dust jackets, I'm going to go ahead and spend one more minute examining it. This time I'll show you the interior flaps. I'll go ahead and get everything spread out for you, just so you can see everything at a glance with this dust jacket. Like I said, I really like the punch of color with that bright blue on the spine and the back. I also just really like that standard cover. I again like the Superman homage, kind of seeing the superhero costume under the shirt. I just think it looks really sharp. And after one final look at that dust jacket, we will go ahead and transition over to the hardback book itself, and we'll take a look at the art we have printed there. So the design work on the hardback book is similar to the art we saw on the back cover of the dust jacket, where it's predominantly a field of red with white detail work. But we have Spider-Man facing off against some of his enemies, and it is essentially a wraparound hardback art cover. I think that this is really nice. This isn't lifted necessarily directly from a comic panel. It's more of an artistic choice here, but I think it's really fun to see some of the mainstay Spider-Man villains and, of course, our hero in this style. A really nicely made book. And now as I go ahead and put this down, we can go ahead and take a look at the binding for this omnibus. So as I mentioned at the top, this is a sewn binding, and I'm happy to report there is a really good eye on this book, at least for me. I feel like the pages opened up very well. There was very minimal gutter loss throughout. This was an easy, readable copy, and overall, I couldn't be happier with this binding. I think it just looks really solid. Okay, and now that we've gone ahead and wrapped up our look at the exteriors of the book and the binding, we can jump into the collection proper. Now, as we go into this book, we have the end pages, a title page, the kind of creator breakdown page where you can see everything that's collected and who wrote, penciled, things like that on the book. Really helpful to have in lieu of a proper table of contents, I should think. And after that, we're off to the races, and essentially we dive right into Chip Zdarsky's run on Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man. No, this is not the main Amazing Spider-Man line. This is one of the kind of sister books. Spectacular Spider-Man, it's been around for some time. But Zdarsky starts off with his own #1 issue before ultimately reverting to those legacy numbers, I think at 297, whatever I said earlier. But this run, is like 16, 17 issues or so. We've got an annual in there. And that is essentially how we start this omnibus, just with his entire run on Spectacular Spider-Man. One of the things I really enjoyed about this is that you had kind of ongoing plot threads throughout his entire run, but there were a couple good kind of bite-sized stories and longer multi-issue story arcs that all kind of dovetailed and fed into each other pretty seamlessly. Something I liked about this book too, we really had a building of the relationship between Peter Parker and J. Jonah Jameson, the longtime publisher of the Daily Bugle, the ex-mayor of New York, who has always considered Spider-Man a menace. Now, we do have some really good character moments between Peter and good old JJ throughout this book. We also have Peter meeting a new girl who's kind of a stand-up comedian who he tries to flirt with and date as Spider-Man, and the reappearance of Teresa Parker? ? These are all really fun elements. We also have the Human Torch, Johnny Storm, show up as a really good supporting character and kind of just friend of Spider-Man throughout this little run. The art throughout this run I feel like is very consistent as well. It does change hands a couple of times, but I really liked all the artists attached. I think that we got some good variety, but everything was just pretty strong. Now, this does make up, I would say, at least half and probably a little bit more than half of this omnibus, just with this, 16, 17 issues or so of Spectacular Spider-Man. After that, though, we do transition over to Spider-Man Life Story, which is a, I think, 6-issue miniseries and annual, but it can be read as kind of a standalone graphic novel. That's actually how I first read and reviewed that story on the channel here. I had an oversized hardcover edition before upgrading here to this omnibus. Anyway, after Life Story, we go ahead and finish this book with Spider-Man Spider's Shadow, which is a 5 or 6 issue kind of what if Spider-Man had never gotten rid of the Venom symbiote, or at least not when he should have. Really, really a fun story here, and these are kind of the works of Zdarsky on Spider-Man. After that, we have a wealth of extras at the back of the book. But anyway, I wanted to kind of set the stage with how this book is mapped and what we have collected here. But now I'll go ahead and start talking about these individual segments. I think for Spectacular Spider-Man, there's more narrative to cover, so I'll just kind of cherry pick some of my favorite story beats. I think for me, one of the boldest and most standout revelations in this book, and again, there were spoilers at the beginning, but essentially we have jolly J. Jonah Jameson discovering that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. And I say discovering, but really it's Peter. He decides to take off his mask and share with him who he is. How we get to that point, though, is really fun and interesting. Essentially, J. Jonah Jameson was kicked out of the Bugle, he's no longer the mayor, and he's really trying to find his place in the world. He has an online blog, but he's kind of become the older man that's just shouting, but he has the heart of this just bleeding edge journalist, but he's had this decades-long grudge against Spider-Man, and it's really holding back his life and kind of become this all-consuming hatred or vendetta against Spider-Man. And it all kind of comes to a head in this storyline, and we ultimately have Spider-Man needing information from J. Jonah Jameson, who has kind of found leads on a villain, thanks to Betty Brant and himself kind of trying to track it down. So in exchange for this intel, Spider-Man agrees to sit down for like an hour-long interview with J. Jonah Jameson at his apartment. Throughout that interview, the tensions are really high. There's an issue that's called My Dinner with Jonah, and it's really fantastic. It's just kind of exploring the history of these two characters and the animosity that they share. But it culminates with these really powerful character beats where you get to see how broken Jameson really is as an individual and how he takes out a lot of his hardships in his life on Spider-Man, almost using him as like a scapegoat and being unwilling to admit how much that if he lets go of that hatred, what does he really have left with his life? And has he been misassigning that blame his whole life? And he just feels really alone. And we have Spider-Man stressed beyond belief and just taking so much verbal abuse over the years from Jameson. But ultimately, he sees a moment of vulnerability, and in that moment, he decides to unmask. Moments later, though, we have officials and kind of officers showing up, and Peter realizes that Jameson essentially called them over, and he says basically, "Don't out me," and he leaves. From there, though, we have Jameson really wrestling with that revelation and what it means. He feels ripped off of all the pictures that Peter Parker sold of Spider-Man throughout the years, but he starts to understand that he was just a boy trying to do the best he can, and he honestly knows Peter Parker fairly intimately at this point in his life, so trying to reconcile these two identities really kind of blows his mind, but he ultimately nets out at wanting to help Peter Parker, wanting to help Spider-Man, and kind of becoming his ally and assistant, whether or not Spider-Man wants it or not. Another really big character bit in this book is the return of Teresa Parker, his maybe or maybe not sister who knows his secret identity. This character was used really well. I will admit, this was my first introduction to the character. I had not heard of this character before reading this spectacular Spider-Man run here, but I really liked her. She had a lot of agency. She's more than just a sister character, and I really thought how they used her was really fun. It really added a great dynamic and relationship to this book. And we had a little bit of a trio at one point with her, him, and Johnny Storm's Human Torch, and then the group kind of changed and grew with Jameson showing up as well. Before too long, though, we also have the Tinkerer as kind of a main villain in the early arcs of this book. I really like that as well. We're introduced to a character who may be the Tinkerer's brother. I thought that was fun. There's this whole conspiracy about these kind of stolen Iron Man Stark phones. We have Riri Williams as Ironheart showing up a few times, a couple other heroes like Black Panther and Hawkeye. But anyway, we have a lot of great kind of misadventures around New York. And this eventually spills out into kind of a time travel narrative, courtesy of Doctor Doom, who's sort of a reformed anti-hero character during this era. But anyway, we have J. Jonah Jameson, Teresa, and Peter going back in time to essentially stop the Tinkerer from enacting a really horrendous plan sometime in the future. This plan involves a kind of AI sentient alien invasion that threatens the whole world in the present day. But anyway, these characters go back, they meet their past selves, and they kind of alter the timeline through them. We have some really fun interactions between young Peter Parker and, present-day Spider-Man. The Jamesons, we have J. Jonah Jameson talking to his younger self and just seeing the passion and obsession he has with Spider-Man, realizing it might be his downfall. And we have Teresa tagging up with Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D., and that is a really fun arc as well. Anyway, all the time travel stuff I actually think works surprisingly great. They return to the present and find that they have changed the timeline substantially. We have Peter Parker never becoming Spider-Man really for any appreciable length of time because he just sees the inherent tragedy and the struggle that present-day Peter would have had to deal with. So instead, he becomes kind of a scientist, industrialist. He's with Gwen Stacy, who's still alive. But all is not for the better in this dystopian vision of an alternate present. This leads to one of the greatest climaxes of this spectacular Spider-Man run for me, where we have him fighting off villains in this alternate present before ultimately going back and resetting the timeline, making it back to the way it was. And then we, of course, have Spider-Man and team battling the Tinkerer and these AI alien people. We have some cool self-sacrificial moments for Spider-Man, and we have some good saves throughout this. But that was the end of a major runner on this book, and it was really satisfying, I thought. It was a ton of fun. We then have a fun issue at one point that is illustrated by Mike and Laura Allred, which I love to see. I am a huge fan of the Allreds. I know I loved what they did with Silver Surfer for Dan Slott, for example. I know I've reviewed that a couple times on this channel. But we have a great little issue there where Jameson's kind of haunted from one of his own enemies of the past, and Spider-Man's trying to save him. But it is just really fun to see the Allreds team up and give us their version of Spider-Man. I really loved that. Now, one of the last story arcs in this book is a really trippy Sandman story where Sandman comes back, but he's not totally right. He can't solidify himself right, and his mind is kind of going to this weird distant future version of himself that's been reborn, but that consciousness is trying to break its way into the present and take over his body. Anyway, it leans into this kind of sci-fi fantasy space. The art is also really, really interesting. I don't really know how to describe it. It's more animated, more stylized, but this is maybe a 3 or 4 issue little arc that takes place toward the back end of that Spectacular Spider-Man run. And I found myself really compelled. It was actually one of the best Sandman stories I've read in comic books recently. Now, after we finish that Spectacular Spider-Man run, we do transition over to the Spider-Man Life Story miniseries, which in my mind is the peak content for this omnibus. This is my high bar. This was easily a driving factor for this book in many people's minds, including myself. Now, I did have the hardcover edition of this previously, which I sold after getting this collection since it was all included here. But I love this story. I have talked about it extensively already, but to go back for it in case you don't want to go and seek out that other video, it is a mini-series that takes this idea that in the 1960s, when the Spider-Man comics were first coming out, you have Spider-Man being bitten by that radioactive spider, being endowed with spider-like abilities, and becoming, of course, the titular Amazing Spider-Man. Well, that all happens in the 60s in this Life Story mini-series, but then we have Spider-Man aging between the 60s all the way into the 2010s, and each issue is essentially a decade. So issue 1 is the 60s, then the 70s, then the 80s, and so on and so on. What's really cool about this is Zdarsky has Peter and Spider-Man in a way that we really haven't seen, just aging up in time, and we have him hitting the major storyline milestones of each decade respectively, and I really loved what they did there. They had play with things like the Clone Saga, Kraven's Last Hunt, the death of Gwen Stacy, ? We had so many of these great plot bits. We get all the way up to more Lun and some of that stuff in the early 2000s, but it's all respinned and remixed in a new way. We even get nods to things like Miles Morales and Superior Spider-Man and the Marvel Civil War, but it's all just handled really well, and there's a deep focus on the characters themselves and kind of the character drama of Spider-Man and his life. Now, of course, this whole miniseries takes place in kind of a what-if, different sort of Marvel universe, but I really love this vision of Spider-Man and the Marvel universe in general. I think it is a little bit bleak, but because of that, the hopeful points really do punch out pretty extremely. I really love seeing the kind of tragedies and victories of Spider-Man played out across these couple of issues. I really think it's just a masterstroke, and in my mind, it is absolutely a modern-day Spider-Man classic. In fact, it might be one of my favorite single Spider-Man works I've read in recent years. An absolute triumph, and I'm so happy they included it in this omnibus, in this great oversized hardcover edition. We also have that annual, which is also within that Life Story universe, and it follows Jameson a bit, but it's all really good stuff, and it's penciled by the incredible Mark Bagley, who has, of course, done so many just legendary runs with Spider-Man. Obviously, his stuff with David Miscellany and Brian Michael Bendis in Ultimate Spider-Man, and now something like this. Really, really loved the pairing of Zdarsky and Bagley. It just worked, and it felt just like an iconic, definitive Spider-Man experience. Now, if you want more from me regarding Spider-Man Life Story, you can absolutely check out my full review of just that story. I'll try to link it to this video if I remember, but I had a lot of fun talking about it then, and I had a lot of fun talking about it now. After we're done with Life Story, though, we transition to the final big kind of arc in this book, and that is the Spider-Man Spider Shadow miniseries. This is that 5 or 6 issue little miniseries that Zdarsky did that's also in its own kind of separate Marvel universe. This isn't like mainstream canon, but it is a fantastic book, and the art from Pasquale Ferry is really recognizable and nice to see as well. But the whole setup for this story is essentially, what if when Peter went to get the symbiote costume examined by the Fantastic Four and they realized it was kind of a symbiotic parasitic life form, what if instead of Peter getting rid of the suit, he decides to keep it? What would happen? And that's really what we have play out across these handful of issues, and it is fantastic. I think for anyone who's a fan of that symbiote suit, that alien costume, this is a banger. This was so much fun. I really had a blast entering this world with Zdarsky, and I think that he honestly went directions I wouldn't have expected. I think before I had read this, I assumed Spider Shadow was just like the corruption story and just him going darker and darker and also ultimately having to be stopped by his peers. But what we have is that all happening maybe in the first 2 or 3 issues of this miniseries. After that, we have Peter trying to fight the symbiote kind of independently of it being on himself. But yeah, I really liked it here. So essentially, Peter rejects the removal of the symbiote suit, and he's sort of corrupted by it. He becomes a bit more brutal, stops pulling his punches. He starts to have all these trippy nightmares, and it's just kind of whispering and messing with his mind. And we basically have him being a bit more brutal than he needs to against the Hobgoblin, unmasking him and just being really violent. So the Hobgoblin kind of stalks him, gets revenge, and ends up inadvertently killing Aunt May, which leads to Spider-Man beating him up, webbing him up, and murdering the Hobgoblin. And basically, the Venom alien symbiote convinces him that with great power comes great responsibility, but his responsibility is to end these criminals, not to let them get away. So this becomes kind of a corruption of his essential core motivating belief, ideal, what have you, from Uncle Ben. And so he starts to go on a rampage, and we have Kingpin realizing this is a problem and trying to set up people to stop him, and he just keeps plowing through. We have the Sinister Six kind of forming to stop him. We actually have an Eddie Brock who was disgruntled and never became Venom, basically in this crew trying to stop him, but Peter Parker just lays most of them to waste. We have J. Jonah Jameson again showing up in a Zdarsky Spider-Man work, kind of offering his aid at one point. I really do like how Zdarsky highlighted Jameson. I think that this was a masterstroke, and I think he just used him well throughout his entire canon here with Spider-Man. But anyway, we have all of this going on, and ultimately Peter Parker is able to get rid of the symbiote, but the symbiote moves on to Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, and using his body and his brain is able to conduct all these crazy experiments on the symbiotes, and they take over him and Ben Grimm and then a lot of the superheroes, and we have this kind of showdown at the Baxter Building. We have Mary Jane Watson, Spider-Man, and the Human Torch, amongst others, trying to stop the symbiote. This leads to some eventual tragedies, but the resolution is ultimately that Spider-Man is sort of exonerated or looked past for his crimes, believing it to be the influence of the symbiote. And we have Spider-Man, while he's down on the outs and feeling shame, basically invited to join the Fantastic Four and make something more of himself going into the future and to leave these regrets behind. I thought that this was a spectacular miniseries, did not expect the resolution we got, and I just thought it was a very, very fun little world to visit. A really, really great inclusion to this omnibus, and honestly, a fun little cap on this collection. The true cap to this collection, however, though, has been what I've been flipping through here, which is the extras included at the back, which is a gigantic variant cover art gallery for the Spectacular Spider-Man, Life Story, the Spider Shadow stuff, and it is amazing. I'm not even showing every single page here, but honestly, it is a wealth of great covers that are reprinted here full size. Love to see it. Great showcasing of some of the industry's top professionals. In addition to the cover art gallery, we also have some behind-the-scenes images and some notes from Zdarsky, especially about how he chose the covers for each of the Life Story issues and how he sketched them out and kind of caught vision for them and what he wanted them to look like, things like that. Really a great wealth of extras at the end of an already packed-out book. And as we wind down with the very last of the extras in this collection, that's going to bring this Spider-Man by Chip Zdarsky Omnibus to a close. A really fun collection here. I've loved Zdarsky for years, between his stuff on Daredevil, Batman, Howard the Duck, Marvel 2-in-1, that Fantastic Four kind of book he wrote. I've just really enjoyed his stuff, and this was a real treat. And I really do just love that standard cover. Now all that's left to do is to give this collection a grade. For easily the most fun I've had with a Spider-Man omnibus in some time, including such a wide array of different storylines and artistic talent. For these reasons and more, the Comic Book Report is happy to give Spider-Man by Chip Zdarsky, the Omnibus, an A. This was a must-read for any Spider-Man or Chip Zdarsky fan. I cannot speak highly enough about it. I just had an absolute blast making my way through it. I think it has a little bit of something for everyone. It has a lot of the great character, deep feel moments that Zdarsky can be known for, along with some great action and honestly humor peppered in throughout. Really, really a fun collection that, again, I just absolutely loved. Super happy with it. But let me know what you think of Spider-Man by Chip Zdarsky. Do you have this omnibus? Do you have other collections? Are you a Spider-Man fan? Let me know all of these things and more in the comments. And for everyone else, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your like, that comment we talked about, and maybe check out one of my other videos on your way out. Thanks, have a good one.